Sarah Mitchell stood at the courthouse steps on a gray November morning and her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her simple cream dress and she thought about her daughter Emma waiting at home with the neighbor and she wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The marriage wasn't supposed to be like this and there was no love and no romance and just a desperate solution to an impossible problem and her landlord had given her one final notice and Emma needed new shoes and the medical bills from last year's surgery still arrived in red envelopes and Sarah had run out of options and run out of pride. That's when her friend Rita from the diner mentioned Mr. Harrison and told her he was looking for someone and said it might be the answer to her prayers and Sarah had laughed bitterly because she'd stopped believing in prayers a long time ago. But desperation makes us do things we never imagined and so here she was about to marry a man she'd only met twice and a man whose cold blue eyes seemed to look right through her and whose expensive suits made her feel small and insignificant. Thomas Harrison was everything Sarah wasn't and he was wealthy and controlled and untouchable and he spoke in clipped sentences and never smiled and made it clear this was a business arrangement and nothing more and he needed a wife for reasons he didn't explain and she needed money for reasons that were painfully obvious. The ceremony took 6 minutes and the judge spoke words that should have meant something but felt hollow in that sterile room and Thomas slipped a simple gold band on her finger without meeting her eyes and Sarah repeated vows she didn't feel and signed papers that changed her name and her life. They drove to his house in silence and his car smelled of leather and expensive cologne and Sarah watched the neighborhoods change from familiar to foreign and the houses grew larger behind iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges and she felt like she was leaving behind everything she knew. The house took her breath away and it was a sprawling colonial with white columns and gardens that looked like paintings and rooms that echoed when you walked through them and Sarah thought about her tiny apartment with the leaking faucet and peeling linoleum and felt the distance between their worlds grow even wider. Thomas showed her to a bedroom on the second floor and told her she could decorate it however she liked and said Emma could have the room next door and his voice was polite but empty and then he went to his study and closed the door and Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and cried quietly into her hands. Emma arrived the next day with her backpack and her stuffed rabbit and her wide curious eyes and she walked through the house touching everything gently like she was in a museum and when she saw her new bedroom she whispered that it was like a princess room and Sarah's heart broke a little because her daughter deserved this and deserved so much more. Thomas avoided them at first and he left early for work and came home late and ate dinner in his study and moved through the house like a ghost and Sarah kept to her own space and made meals in the huge kitchen and helped Emma with homework at the dining table and tried to understand this strange new life. But children have a way of breaking down walls and Emma wasn't afraid of Thomas like Sarah was and one evening she knocked on his study door and asked him to help with her math homework and Thomas looked startled but he didn't say no. Sarah watched from the doorway as Thomas sat with Emma at the dining table and explained fractions with surprising patience and Emma giggled when he drew funny faces next to the numbers and for just a moment his stern expression softened and Sarah saw something human beneath the armor. After that Emma found reasons to talk to Thomas and she'd tell him about her day at school and show him drawings she'd made and ask him questions about everything and anything and slowly something shifted and Thomas started coming home earlier and eating dinner with them and the house felt a little less empty. Sarah noticed small changes and fresh flowers appeared in the kitchen and the refrigerator filled with Emma's favorite foods and a swing set materialized in the backyard and Thomas never mentioned these things and never took credit but Sarah knew. One Saturday morning Sarah found Thomas in the garden pulling weeds and his expensive shirt was dirty and his hair was messy and he looked almost human and she brought him coffee without thinking and they stood together in comfortable silence and watched Emma chase butterflies across the lawn. Thomas asked about her life and really asked like he wanted to know and Sarah found herself telling him about her late husband who died in a car accident 5 years ago and about the struggle to keep going and about the nights she'd cried into her pillow and prayed for strength and her voice cracked but she kept talking. He listened without interrupting and without judging and when she finished he told her quietly that his parents had arranged his life like a business deal and that he'd learned early to keep people at a distance and that loneliness becomes normal when you've never known anything else and Sarah understood then that they were both survivors in their own ways. The weeks turned into months and something gentle grew between them and it wasn't romance exactly but something deeper and more real and they became partners in caring for Emma and in managing the household and in filling the silence with small conversations that mattered. Sarah started decorating the house and added warm colors and soft textures and photographs of Emma and slowly the mansion became a home and Thomas never complained about the changes and sometimes she'd catch him smiling at a pillow she'd chosen or a plant she'd placed on a table. Emma's 8th birthday came in spring and Sarah planned a small party, but Thomas surprised them both and he'd invited Emma's entire class and hired a magician and filled the backyard with balloons and streamers, and Emma's face glowed with joy and Sarah's eyes filled with tears. That evening after the guests left and Emma slept peacefully upstairs, and Sarah found Thomas on the back porch and she thanked him in her voice thick with emotion, and he shook his head and said that Emma deserved happiness and then added quietly that they both did, and something shifted in the air between them. Thomas reached for her hand and his touch was tentative and unsure, and he told her he'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to come home to laughter and to warmth and to people who cared, and his voice broke on the last word and Sarah squeezed his hand and understood perfectly. She told him that she'd married him out of desperation but stayed out of choice, and that somewhere along the way this arrangement had become real, and that she looked forward to his footsteps in the hallway and his quiet presence at breakfast and the way he listened to Emma's endless stories with such patience and attention. Thomas pulled her closer and wrapped his arms around her, and they stood together under the stars, and Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years, and she felt safe and valued and home, and when he kissed her forehead it was tender and full of promise. The truth about Thomas's wealth came out gradually, and Sarah learned he owned the company where dozens of her friends worked, and that his charitable foundation had funded the hospital that saved Emma, and that his quiet generosity touched countless lives, and she understood then that his coldness had been protection and not cruelty. They remarried a year later, and this time with Emma as their flower girl and Rita crying happy tears in the front row, and vows that meant everything, and Sarah wore a dress the color of cream and Thomas smiled and it transformed his face, and the judge who'd married them the first time said he'd never seen such a change in two people. Life wasn't perfect, because life never is, and there were disagreements and difficult days and moments of doubt, but there was also laughter and kindness and the steady comfort of two people who'd found each other in unexpected ways, and Thomas learned to express feelings and Sarah learned to accept love, and Emma grew up knowing she was cherished. Years later Sarah would tell people that sometimes the best blessings come disguised as disasters, and that love isn't always fireworks and passion, and sometimes it's the quiet choice to keep showing up and to be kind and to build something real with imperfect materials and flawed hearts. And Thomas would add that he'd gained everything the day he stopped protecting his heart and let two people in, and that family isn't always about blood, and sometimes it's about choosing each other every single day and making a home where there was only emptiness before. Emma would remember the swing set and the birthday parties and the evenings when her mother and Thomas would sit together reading while she did homework, and the way love felt in that house, and not dramatic or loud but steady and warm and absolutely certain, and she would carry that feeling with her always and know what real love looked like. In the end Sarah understood that she hadn't been forced to marry anyone, and she'd made a choice in a moment of desperation, but then she'd made another choice and another, and to stay and to try and to open her heart, and Thomas had done the same, and together they'd built something neither could have built alone, and that was the truest kind of love there was.